Ever feel like you're watching a geopolitical chess game where, half the pieces are basically invisible?
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into exactly these unseen battles, conflicts that don't look like traditional wars, no marching armies, but they are profoundly shaping our world. We're really pulling back the curtain on the long, bitter, and, rarely direct conflict between Iran and Israel in the Middle East.
And our mission here for this deep dive is to truly unpack how these, well, wars fought in the shadows actually operate. We want to explore why they've become the preferred strategy for some powerful nations and what makes them so incredibly dangerous, so complex for the whole region and, frankly, beyond.
So think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to understanding this hidden architecture of conflict that's shaping the modern Middle East.
Exactly.
So, okay, we hear the term proxy war thrown around a lot, but in this specific context, Iran and Israel, what are we really talking about? What are the defining features? Because, like you said, it's not formal declarations, is it?
No, it's fundamentally different from, traditional warfare. You don't have massive armies facing off. There are no official declarations of war. Instead, these conflicts are fought through, other hands and other lands,
Right.
through militias, through deploying missiles, and very much through spreading ideology. The core dynamic here is that nations like Iran and Israel, they actively avoid that direct confrontation.
But they're still locked in this struggle.
Oh, absolutely. A bitter struggle for influence and ultimately for survival.
That distinction feels really crucial. Beyond just, avoiding a direct fight, what are the deeper drivers here? Why use proxies? It feels like it goes beyond just power grabs.
It absolutely does. It's really about survival. It's about identity. It's about regional influence.
Okay.
These aren't just like detached chess moves on some grand board.
Hmm.
For the nations involved, the stakes are genuinely existential. It touches on their fundamental right to exist, their vision for the future of the whole region.
Okay. And looking at that strategic play, Iran has cultivated this network, right? What it calls the axis of resistance. Can you give us a sense of what that actually looks like? How does it operate in these shadows?
Well, Iran's strategy over decades really has been to develop this powerful, often quite covert network of proxy groups across the Middle East.
And these aren't just loose allies, you're saying?
No, not at all. They are integral tools of Iranian statecraft, of strategy. They receive everything from, sophisticated missile parts shipped through shadowy networks to battlefield tactics drilled by elite commanders, like from the Quds Force. We're talking about really key players here. Hezbollah in Lebanon, of course, various Shiite militias operating in Iraq, the Houthis down in Yemen, and groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza.
Wow, that's an incredibly wide net. So what's the big strategic win for Iran in building this whole elaborate system?
It's fundamentally about deniable influence. It's a masterclass in it, really.
Yeah.
This network lets Iran extend its reach far, far beyond its own borders. It allows them to strike, to pressure, to influence situations without necessarily exposing itself to direct, conventional retaliation.
So they get leverage.
Immense leverage and a crucial degree of plausible deniability. It's almost like a geopolitical magic trick,
Yeah.
where the absence of direct fingerprints becomes a weapon itself. It lets both sides push boundaries without necessarily tripping those conventional alarms for all-out war.
And we've seen very real examples of this playing out. Hezbollah, for instance, seems like a direct extension, maybe the prime example.
Indeed, yeah. Hezbollah in Lebanon is probably the textbook illustration. It was formed with significant Iranian help back in the 1980s.
Right.
And today it functions as Iran's, front line right on Israel's northern border. It's deeply embedded in southern Lebanon. It possesses, reportedly, tens of thousands of rockets. And it operates as both a powerful political force within Lebanon and a major military threat to Israel. So when tensions flare up, say, in Gaza or Syria, Israel's immediate concern often snaps right back north to Hezbollah.
And what about the Houthis in Yemen? We hear a lot about them, especially with the Red Sea attacks recently. How do they fit into this bigger Iran-Israel picture? They're geographically quite distant.
That's a great question. The Houthi rebels in Yemen are another key Iranian-backed group, and their attacks first on Saudi Arabia and now more visibly on commercial shipping in the Red Sea, these aren't just isolated incidents.
Oh, it connects back.
Oh, yes. While they might be physically far from the direct Iran-Israel border, these actions deliberately contribute to regional instability. And every act of chaos, every disruption, frankly, strengthens Iran's leverage across the Middle East. It increases the perceived value of its proxies for, say, future negotiations or just as a deterrent. It's all interconnected.
One of the most critical things, though, and maybe one of the scariest parts you mentioned, is how unpredictable these conflicts are. It sounds like even Iran doesn't always have, like, total push-button control over these groups it supports.
That is the fundamental paradox and the fundamental problem. Proxy wars are notoriously messy, they're unpredictable, and they are incredibly difficult to fully control. So while Iran provides the funding, the weapons, the strategic guidance, its proxies aren't just, puppets on a string. They have their own local agendas, their own leadership structures, and they can react independently, sometimes emotionally, to events right there on the ground.
So the tool can sometimes act on its own.
Precisely. The inherent paradox is that the very act of delegation, which is meant to control risk for the patron state, often creates the most volatile and unpredictable outcomes. A local skirmish can suddenly eclipse the broader strategic intent. A single drone attack, a missile fired without maybe full clearance, a small border skirmish, any of these can escalate very, very rapidly. And when they do, Israel's response is often quite forceful, sometimes targeting Iranian personnel directly or infrastructure, particularly in places like Syria.
So Iran kind of sets the stage, but the actors might ad-lib, sometimes dangerously.
Like a good way to put it.
But this whole intricate web
Yeah.
Iran has built, it isn't just happening unopposed. How does Israel see this? What's their counter-strategy been?
Well, from Israel's perspective, every single one of these proxy groups isn't separate. They see it as part of one large interconnected threat network. And the design, as they perceive it, is to surround and ultimately to strangle the country.
Right.
So their overriding goal is simple: prevent Iran from tightening that noose at almost any cost.
So what does that look like in terms of Israeli actions? They're obviously not just sitting back and waiting.
Not at all. Israel has adopted a very proactive, some call it preemptive, stance. They conduct regular air raids, particularly on Iranian supply routes moving through Syria.
Targeting weapons transfers and things like that.
Exactly. And sometimes targeting Iranian commanders, generals who are coordinating proxy activity on the ground. They've also been implicated in cyber attacks or suspected sabotage missions deep inside Iran itself.
Wow. Inside Iran.
Yes. It's a new kind of warfare, almost, where Israel might launch, say, a virtual strike deep inside Iran, a digital ghost in the machine, if you will, disrupting maybe missile facilities or parts of the nuclear program, potentially without ever firing a conventional shot. It's a very active, though often undeclared, campaign.
And the result of all this back and forth is what you called a permanent state of near war, where civilians inevitably are so often caught right in the middle.
Yeah.
But you also stressed none of this is officially a war. This is that gray zone you talked about.
That's the insidious power, isn't it, of proxy conflict. There's no formal declaration. There's no peace treaty to even aim for. There's no clear battlefield where armies line up.
Yeah.
It exists entirely in the deniable, in the plausible. And that makes it incredibly difficult to define, let alone contain or resolve.
Which raises another critical point.
Right.
Beyond the actual missiles and strikes, there's a huge psychological dimension here, right? Especially around the narrative. How does that play out globally?
Oh, massively. Proxy wars are profoundly weapons of narrative. Each side uses these actions, these deniable actions, to shape how the world sees them, to shape public opinion.
So give me an example.
Well, Iran, for instance, can publicly deny direct responsibility for, say, a Houthi attack. They can claim they're merely supporting oppressed peoples or resistance movements who are defending themselves.
Plausible deniability again.
Exactly. And Israel, on the other hand, can frame its actions, even powerful cross-border strikes, as legitimate self-defense against terrorism, necessary steps to protect its citizens.
And the result, of course, is that the lines just get completely blurred, truth gets twisted, and it makes it incredibly hard for anyone on the outside, for you watching at home, to really grasp what's actually happening.
It does. And of course, the United States is almost never far from this equation.
Right. How does the U.S. fit in?
Well, obviously, as a very close ally of Israel and historically a significant opponent of Iran's regional ambitions, the U.S. inevitably gets drawn into these proxy dynamics.
They've seen that recently.
Absolutely. We've seen Iranian-backed militias attack U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. American warships have had to respond directly to Houthi threats against shipping in the Red Sea. Washington is constantly walking this incredibly fine line, trying to protect its interests, support its allies, but also desperately trying to avoid getting dragged into a much wider Middle East war.
Which brings us right to that critical danger,
Yeah.
escalation. And it's incredibly complex, volatile web. One wrong move, one miscalculation, it could have truly catastrophic consequences.
That's the core terrifying risk. It
Mhm.
really is. In a proxy war, one wrong move by a maybe relatively small group acting semi-autonomously, it can trigger a completely disproportionate response from a much larger power. You can easily imagine a scenario. A militia attacks an Israeli or maybe an American base. Israel retaliates strongly, perhaps against Iranian assets in Syria. Iran feels compelled to respond, maybe with a direct missile volley. And then suddenly the U.S. feels forced to intervene more directly.
And it spirals.
Exactly. What began as a localized, possibly deniable skirmish spirals into a full-blown regional war that actually nobody, not even the initial actors, really wanted. That's not just, abstract speculation. It's a constant, palpable threat hanging over the entire region.
What's also fascinating here, and you touched on this, is that this isn't just cold, hard power politics.
Right.
It's deeply, deeply rooted in ideology and these existential stakes for both sides.
Indeed, it really is. For Iran, supporting these proxies is fundamental to its identity, its post-revolutionary identity as an Islamic state, resisting what it sees as Western and Zionist domination. It's core to their narrative.
And for Israel.
And for Israel, responding to these threats isn't just about defense tactics. It's about survival. It's about existing in a region where its fundamental right to exist is often questioned. The stakes really are profoundly existential for both players.
And these conflicts, they aren't happening in isolation chambers, are they? They're globally interconnected.
Yeah.
What happens there has wider implications.
That's a crucial point to grasp, especially in today's world, which is becoming increasingly polarized again. You have global powers like Russia, China, the U.S., all playing their own roles, pursuing their own interests in the region.
Right.
So these proxy wars become even more complex, more layered. A clash in Gaza can instantly change the dynamic in Lebanon. A strike in Syria affects military posture over in Iraq. A message sent, maybe subtly, to Iran can echo all the way through Yemen via the Houthis. Everything is connected in this very delicate, very dangerous balance.
So if this indirect type of war is becoming, as you said, the preferred option, maybe lower risk, at least initially for the main actors, high impact and deeply confusing for outsiders,
Right.
what does that actually mean for finding a path forward? Or there may be an alarming lack of a path forward.
Well, the primary danger is precisely that lack of clarity you mentioned. It significantly increases the chance of a devastating miscalculation. That's the immediate risk.
And the way out.
The way out of this labyrinth. It's incredibly challenging. Look, these proxy networks, they aren't built overnight. They serve deep political, religious, strategic purposes that go way beyond just simple military objectives. So dismantling them, it requires far more than just military counterstrikes. It demands sustained, serious diplomacy. It likely needs significant economic shifts in the region, and crucially, it requires long-term trust building.
Which seems almost impossible right now.
All of those things are exceptionally difficult to achieve in a region that is just soaked in decades, centuries sometimes, of suspicion and historical scars. Understanding this intricate complexity, though,
Right.
understanding how it all works, that is the absolutely crucial first step.
So just to kind of wrap this part up.
Yeah.
These proxy wars, they really aren't just background noise in the Middle East, are they? They are, in fact, the very structure, the very framework through which modern conflicts are increasingly being fought there.
Absolutely. And as long as these indirect conflicts continue, any real sustainable peace will remain incredibly fragile. And the threat of a much wider war, that catastrophic escalation we talked about, will perpetually loom over everyone.
Yeah.
It really encourages us, I think, encourages you listening to consider that in this age of proxy war, the real battlefield might be far from where the bombs are actually falling. It's often psychological, it's intensely political, and it's profoundly about who controls the global narrative.